All right, so I'll start with the introduction. Dr. Hilary Marusak is a developmental neuroscientist and tenured associate professor of psychiatry and behavioral neurosciences at Wayne State University School of Medicine. She directs the division of cannabinoids in neurodevelopment, Candid, and the Think Lab, which use neuroimaging and behavioral. Oops, sorry. And behavioral approaches to study the effect of cannabis, stress, and the endocannabinoid system on brain development and mental health in youth. Dr. Marusak is a PI or MPI on studies funded by the NIH, One Mind, and the state of Michigan. She's an associate member of ACNP and serves as non-voting associate member of the ACNP Council. She also holds national leadership and editorial roles, co-founded Science Policy Network Detroit, and hosts the Brainstem podcast to share evidence-based brain science with the public. So we welcome Hilary, who will join us in a few seconds. Dr. Clara G. Zundel is a behavioral neuroscientist and senior postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neurosciences at Wayne State University School of Medicine. Her research examines how environmental exposures, particularly outdoor air pollution, shape brain development and risk for anxiety disorders in youth. Her work integrates functional neuroimaging, psychophysiology, and environmental exposure assessment to understand how physical and built environments influence mental health. Dr. Zundel is a recipient of an NIMH National Research Service Award, F32. In addition to her research, she is actively engaged in science policy and public engagement. She serves on the executive board SciPol Detroit and previously served as an early career policy ambassador for the Society for Neuroscience. Through policy engagement, community outreach, and science communication, she works to bridge the gap between neuroscience research and public policy. And I think this is why we're all here today. So with that, I will welcome Hilary and Clara, and thank you so much for joining us.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to speak to you all about how to get involved in science policy and advocacy, especially as early career researchers, trainees, and clinicians. I wanted to start by briefly talking about why I care so much about science advocacy and policy engagement, because it's become a really important part of my career alongside the research itself. So, as scientists, we spend so much time generating evidence, collecting data, and trying to understand problems that affect people's health and well-being. But many of the decisions that directly shape our research and the health outcomes that we study are actually made outside of academia. They're made at the federal, state, and local policy levels. And one thing I realized pretty early on is that there really are not that many scientists in those decision-making spaces. And so many policymakers are making decisions about issues like environmental regulation, public health funding, climate policy, or mental health initiatives without necessarily having a scientific background or direct experience conducting research. And so this was something my mentor, Dr. Hilary Marusak, recognized early on in her career as well. She actually co-founded the SciPol Detroit, which is our local chapter of the National Science Policy Network at Wayne State University. So as one of her trainees and now a postdoc in the lab, I was exposed very early to conversations around science policy, advocacy, and public engagement, and naturally became more involved over time. And because my own research really focuses on environmental health, so especially air pollution exposure, these issues started to feel pretty tangible to me. So air quality standards, environmental regulations, infrastructure decisions, these are all policy decisions, and they directly influence the exposures that communities experience every day, and ultimately the brain and mental health outcomes that I study in the lab. And I also think that this interest comes from my background more broadly. So I grew up in a family that was very involved in social justice and community advocacy. So I've always been drawn to the idea that science really should not stay in academia or in our labs. It should really help to inform real world decisions and improve people's lives. So over time, I started asking myself, if scientists aren't part of these conversations, who is? And how can I use my own voice in training to help bridge the gap between research, policy, and the public? So before we dive into the rest of today's session, I'd actually love to hear a little bit from all of you. So what brought you here today? Maybe you're already involved in advocacy work and want some new ideas or strategies. Maybe you're curious about how scientists can engage with policy but aren't really sure where to start. Maybe you felt frustrated watching decisions being made about science, healthcare, or mental health and want to learn how to have a voice in those conversations. Or maybe you're just here because this sounded interesting, which is also great. But if you feel comfortable, feel free to unmute and share what motivated you to join today. And if you'd rather not speak, absolutely feel free to drop your thoughts in the chat as well.
I'll say a few words here.
Sure.
So my career is a little bit backwards. I was a probation parole agent for over 20 years. I kind of made a transition to being a therapist, and now, as I'm almost 60, I'm kind of transitioning into I'm in a PhD doctoral program for clinical supervision. So, my my dissertation and my the work I'm doing focuses on 18 to 25-year-olds
Mm,
in the training, trying to train them, trying to understand, all the changes going on today that they face. So I'm just really interested in how I can help people that are, moving into this field and kind of as a leader of people that are trying to figure out, where they fit in developing their skills. So
yeah, absolutely. Thanks for joining us. All right, I see something in the chat. Definitely interested in the topic and learning how to get more involved in advocacy, especially since I work with primary children and adolescents from underserved communities. And I'm tired of seeing policies that aren't backed up by scientific evidence. Absolutely. And that's why we need to get involved and have a voice. Great. All right. So now I'm going to go through a bunch of different examples of what advocacy can look like because it is so different and there are a number of different opportunities or ways to get involved. So one of the most visible forms of science advocacy is participating in what are often called Hill Days or legislative advocacy days. So these can happen at multiple levels. They might be federal advocacy trips to Washington, D.C., where scientists and trainees meet directly with members of Congress or their staff. They can also happen at the state level. So, for example, meetings with legislators at your own state capital to discuss issues that are affecting research, healthcare, education, or public health in your own communities. And advocacy absolutely does not have to involve travel either. A lot of really impactful conversations happen through local in-district meetings with representatives back home in their local offices. Um, and I think before I became involved in this work, I imagined that these meetings were really intimidating or highly formal, like you needed to have policy expertise or years of experience to participate. But honestly, a lot of advocacy is simply helping policymakers understand how scientific issues are affecting real people and real communities. And so, as scientists, we bring a really valuable perspective because we're the ones directly conducting the research. We're working with participants and patients. We're training students, applying for funding. And we're really the ones that are seeing firsthand how policy decisions are impacting science and public health. Advocacy can also look a lot more accessible and flexible than people sometimes imagine. So, not every Hill Day requires traveling to Washington, D.C., or spending days at a state capitol. Especially over the past couple of years, a lot of advocacy work has moved into virtual spaces through Zoom meetings and online legislative visits. These virtual meetings can actually be a really great entry point, especially for students, trainees, clinicians, or researchers who may not have the time or funding to travel. So you still get the opportunity to meet with legislative staff, share your perspective, and advocate for issues that matter to you just from your office or your home instead. Another really easy way to get involved is partnering with professional organizations that already organize advocacy efforts and provide training. So, the Society for Neuroscience is a great example of this. So, every year they organize federal advocacy meetings by state, and they help coordinate conversations with congressional offices and provide training beforehand so that participants understand what the major policy issues are, what the specific asks are, and how these meetings typically work. And I think that's really important, right? You're not usually thrown into these spaces completely on your own. Many organizations really want scientists and trainees to participate, so they provide a lot of support and structure to help make advocacy feel really approachable. And advocacy does not always have to be formal. So, a lot of really meaningful advocacy actually happens through everyday conversations and relationship building. So, it can be talking with colleagues in your department about issues affecting researchers or trainee well-being. It can be conversations with community members about why science matters. It can even be, the person sitting next to you on an airplane while you're traveling to a conference asking you what you study, and you having the opportunity to explain why your work is important and how it connects to broader public issues. I think sometimes we picture advocacy as only these big organized meetings with legislators, but advocacy can also simply be helping people better understand science and its relevance to their everyday lives. And honestly, many policymakers and community leaders form their opinions based on the conversations and the stories that they hear from real people. So every interaction is an opportunity to communicate science in a way that's accessible, relatable, and impactful. And so, for those of you who may feel intimidated by the idea of policy advocacy or engagement, this is often one of the easiest places to start, right? So, just becoming more comfortable talking about your work and why it matters outside of academic spaces. Another form of advocacy that I care a lot about is community outreach and science education. So, again, advocacy is not only just speaking to policymakers, it's also about engaging directly with communities and helping make science more accessible and approachable. So, a lot of these photos are from outreach events in local schools and community spaces where we've talked with students about neuroscience, brain health, environmental exposures, mental health, and what it actually looks like to work in science. Sometimes that's having classroom presentations or bringing human brain specimens for students to interact with, or creating hands-on activities that make these scientific concepts feel more tangible and exciting. And these experiences are also incredibly helpful and practical for you to practice your science communication. So they really push you to think about how to explain your complex ideas clearly and in ways that connect with people who may not have a science background. I also think outreach is important because representation and visibility matters. So for many students, especially younger students, this may be one of the first times that they've ever interacted with a scientist or even realize that science could be a career path available to them. And so in that sense, outreach itself becomes a form of advocacy. So advocating for science literacy, advocating for community engagement, and hopefully inspiring the next generation of scientists, clinicians, and advocates. And advocacy can be incredibly simple and again, accessible. So it does not always have to involve organized events, travel, or large time commitments. Sometimes advocacy is just taking a few minutes to contact your representatives and make your voice heard. So one resource I really like is the 5Calls app, which makes it very easy to identify current policy issues, find your elected officials, and it even provides scripts for the phone call, so it makes it really easy. And it's something you can honestly do during your commute to work while you're walking your dog, or, during a quick break in your day. It takes less than 5 minutes. Um, and advocacy does not only have to happen when there's like a major crisis or there's urgent legislation. Yes, you can absolutely contact your reps about specific bills or policies that they're voting on, but you can also simply introduce yourself as a scientist, a clinician, a trainee, or a researcher that lives or works in their district. So you can let them know the kind of work that you do, offer yourself as a scientific resource if they have questions related to neuroscience or mental health, or even invite them to come visit your lab or your institution to learn more about the research that's happening in their own communities. And I think sometimes people underestimate how valuable those relationships and connections can be. So, policymakers and their staff are often expected to make decisions on highly technical topics, and having scientists who are willing to communicate clearly and engage respectfully can make a really meaningful difference and make their job a lot easier as well. All right, I'm just going to take a peek to see if Hilary has joined us yet. I don't see her. So, all right, so I'm going to keep going. So another form of
I
advocacy.
think she's here.
She is here? Oh, good. Let's see.
Oh, now I don't see her. I'll let you know once she's.
Okay. Thank you. Um, so another form of advocacy is the form of writing op-eds or writing opinion pieces outside of academia in local newspapers where your community is able to read about your science in a way that is easy and accessible. So this is a great resource to do. So I had the chance to do one, I think about a year ago. There was a movement called Science Homecoming where people were urging scientists to write op-eds about why science funding matters, or how science funding is used in their local hometown newspaper, so back in their communities where they grew up, to try and increase the awareness across the country, um, and to make, everyday community members be able to see the importance of science and why it matters. Um, And writing an op-ed, it kind of sounds daunting at first, but it's really easy. You just, you write a paragraph about your pitch, what you want to write about, and you send it to the newspaper. And if they like it, they'll say, "Great, send your whole thing." It's a short form writing. It's normally like less than 1,000 words. It's very short. Um, and they're normally very time sensitive. So some of these are about like pollution legislation, um, again, why we need more advocates, some others about cannabis legislation coming down. So if your science involves something that's very timely, you can always pitch to a local newspaper to get the word out about your science in a more accessible way. I see a question in the chat. So, is there a difference in effectiveness of using scripted messages, such as one drafted by an organization, versus personalizing them if we send to our legislators? Yeah, so that's a really great question. I've heard both, I've heard pros for both ways from staff, from legislative staffers. So, if often if offices receive a bunch of the exact same emails, they will count them up and like give them to the representative in terms of numbers, like X amount of people have sent a letter. I think it's always better to personalize it. Um, and it takes 2 seconds to add a personalized sentence at the very beginning. You can keep all of the crafted language from your professional organization or whoever drafted the message. But if you can add some sort of personal connection to it, like, for example, I'm in your home district in Detroit and I do X research, just so it gives it a little bit more of a personalized message. That's what I've heard works best. But there is value in like a mass amounts of the same email as well. So I could see it both ways. All right. So I want to take a minute to quickly go over the difference between science policy versus science advocacy. So science policy really involves developing and evaluating policies that are shaping the research that we do, the healthcare systems and public health regulations and things like that. And it really focuses on how those policies are created, implemented, and assessed. Versus science advocacy, which is about communicating your research to policymakers, organizations, clinicians, and the public, and really focus on raising awareness and helping them, really serving as the gap between research and policy. And so today we're focusing mostly on science advocacy. Um, some of you may have research that's more relevant to policy, and a lot of this can be translated to that work. But for the majority of the talk, we're just going to be talking about advocacy and how to make your voice, um, how to have a voice in the conversation for science advocacy, and really to serve as that link between science and the legislative offices. All right, so I wanted to start with a simple question about why should you care about science policy? I shared a little bit about why I care about science policy, but I'm guessing for most of you, this is not something that you think about day to day, and that's totally fair. We're trained to focus on our research, our data, our papers, and not what's happening in Congress or federal agencies. But the reality is that most research is publicly funded, which means policy decisions are constantly shaping the work that we do, whether we're paying attention to it or not. And so when we actually talk about science policy, we're really talking about decisions that determine what actually gets funded, what populations are prioritized, and even what kinds of data you're able to collect or use. And importantly, this isn't just about your research questions. It also directly affects your training and your career trajectory as well. So policy decisions influence what training grants and fellowships exist, how much trainees are paid, and even who has access to training opportunities in the first place. And so even if you never plan to work in policy, policy is still shaping your path as a scientist or a clinician. And I think the key takeaway and what we'll build on today is that if you're not engaged with science policy and advocacy, it's still shaping your science just without your input. All right, so this graphic is pretty old now, but I couldn't find an updated graph, but it basically shows you who is footing the US research bill, and it's predominantly coming from federal research dollars, which is why we need to have a voice in the federal budget and with legislators in order to prioritize increased funding across the years, funding that's taking into account inflation, and really to advocate for more increased funding because all of the funding from the major research institutions, at least in the United States, are coming from federal dollars. And then again here, this is showing the amount of money that goes to each, the amount of scientific funding from the federal government per each institution. So you can see that the Department of Defense gets almost half of that. The Department of Health and Human Services, which is where NIH comes in, gets the next biggest chunk. There's NSF, there's NASA, there's the Department of Energy, which does a lot of like environmental based research here. And then again, the graph on the right is really showing how while there has been increases specifically to the NIH budget over the years, those increases are not necessarily aligning with inflation. So while it looks like funding for NIH is increasing each year, it's not actually matching how much things cost, how expensive research is. And those are the things that policymakers may not necessarily understand, and why we need to contact them to let them know that, like, yes, this 1 to 3% increase in NIH funding is great, but it's actually still not meeting the mark. Like things, all of these, our equipment are much more expensive these days, and we need to really increase it even more in order to meet that demand. All right. If you have any other questions, feel free to come off mute. I want this to be kind of like a dynamic conversation, or put them in the chat and I can respond in real time. But I just wanted to pause for a couple of seconds to see if anyone had any burning questions before I go into kind of how scientific funding slash policy is made in the United States. All right, I will keep going then. So I wanted to spend just a few minutes giving a really high level
Hilary just
overview.
joined, Clara.
I'm
Oh,
so
good.
sorry,
Yay.
guys. I had a meeting with my boss and I was like, I really gotta go. But Clara's
No
doing
worries.
amazing. Clara, tap me in whenever you want.
Okay, sounds good. So I wanted just to spend a couple of minutes on a really high level overview of how science policy and research funding actually moves through the federal government. Because honestly, this was something that felt very confusing and abstract to me at first. And understanding the basics of this process really helped me better understand when advocacy can be most impactful and why contacting representative actually matters. So I'm not going to do a full civics lesson today, but I do think it's helpful to understand at the broad level how decisions about science funding and research priorities are made, especially the appropriations process and who controls different parts of it. And so once you understand that structure a little better, it becomes much easier to identify where scientists can engage, when key decisions are happening, and where your voice can actually have influence. And so when we think about how science policy happens at the federal level, it really comes down to the three branches of government. But what matters is what each of them controls when it comes to research. So, starting with the legislative branch or Congress, this is really the most important one for you to understand as scientists. So, they control what's often called the power of the purse. So, they decide how much funding agencies like NIH or NSF receives. And so, if you're wondering why did NIH funding go up or down, that decision starts there. And then we have the executive branch. So this includes federal agencies like the National Institute of Health, NSF, the CDC, basically the places that actually run research programs. They don't decide the total budget, but they have a lot of influence over how that money gets distributed, what topics are prioritized, and what kinds of grants or initiatives get emphasized. And so this is also where presidential priorities come into play as well. And then finally, the judicial branch. This is less directly involved in day-to-day science funding, but it's still really important because they interpret laws. So this can affect things like regulatory decisions, data use policies, or broader issues that impact research environments. And so the big takeaway here is that Congress decides how much money exists, agencies decide how it gets used, and then courts can shape how the policies are applied. And so all three of these can ultimately impact your work, even if you never interact with them directly. So when Congress is making policy, there are really two separate processes happening. So first is authorization. So this is where Congress creates or defines a program. So they might say, we're going to fund research on mental health, or we're going to establish this new initiative. But, and this is the key, authorization does not actually provide the money. So it basically says this is allowed and this is what we could spend. Second, appropriations. This is where the actual money comes in. So every year, Congress decides how much funding agencies get and how that funding is distributed. So this is where decisions are made about NIH budgets, grant paylines, and ultimately how many studies actually get funded. So authorization creates the idea, and appropriations determine whether it actually happens. And so this is really important because you can have something that is fully authorized, but if it's not appropriated, it effectively doesn't exist in practice. And so for us as researchers, this is why the annual budget process matters so much. Because even if your area of science is considered important, funding levels can still change year after year. So before I go into these next few slides, I want to acknowledge that a lot of these graphics and organizational charts were adapted from materials created by Lewis Burke Associates, which is a federal lobbying and consulting firm that works closely with many universities, including Wayne State University, on research and higher education advocacy. And I mention that because I think it's also important to highlight that you do not have to navigate advocacy completely on your own. Most universities have offices like government and community affairs, federal relations, or government relations that specifically helped connect researchers with advocacy opportunities, policy updates, and legislative engagement. So if this is something you're interested in, those offices can actually be a really great starting point and a great partner for advocacy work. So I'm not going to walk through all these different committees, but it's just to give you a sense of how Congress is actually organized. So most of the real work happens in committees and subcommittees, not on the House or the Senate floor. There are two types that matter most for science. So authorizing committees, these shape what gets prioritized. So things like health, education, science are often handled in committees like the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, which is often called HELP in the Senate, or in the Science, Space, and Technology Committee in the House. Appropriations subcommittees, these are arguably the most important ones for us. So because they decide how much money actually goes into agencies like NIH. So for example, the Labor, Health, and Human Services, or LHHS subcommittee is the one that determines NIH funding levels. So if you ever engage in advocacy, you're usually not targeting all of Congress. You're targeting specific committees. Like if you're advocating for NIH funding, you don't need to contact every single member of Congress. You'd prioritize members that are on the LHHS Appropriations Subcommittee. All right, so now that we've talked about appropriations, this is what the process actually looks like over the course of the year. If it happens on time, which it rarely does anymore, it typically starts in February. So this is when the president submits a budget request. So this is essentially, here's what we propose for funding and at what levels. And so this includes agencies, again, like the NIH. But the important point is that this is a proposal. It's not a final budget. Then in March, April, Congress responds by setting the overall budget framework. So this is where they decide how much total money is available and they begin shaping priorities. In May and June, this is where things get more detailed. So appropriations subcommittees, like the one that funds NIH, they start drafting and reviewing specific funding bills. And so this is where you might start to see proposed funding levels for specific agencies, and sometimes language comes out about specific priorities. And then ideally by September, everything gets finalized. So the House and Senate reconcile any differences, and the final budget is sent to the president to be signed. But the reality is this process is often delayed. So instead of finishing by September, we get things like continuing resolutions, last minute negotiations, and a lot of uncertainty, and sometimes even government shutdowns, which we experienced this past year. But why this matters for you, this timeline directly affects when grants are released, it affects funding stability, and sometimes even whether funding is delayed or reduced. And so we just talked about how Congress decides the budget, but that's only part of the story. So because once that funding is allocated, the executive branch and especially federal agencies have a lot of influence over how that money is actually used. So this includes agencies, again, like the NIH, the NSF, the CDC, and it also includes offices like the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB. So together, they help shape the president's budget requests each year and set priorities within the agencies. So in practice, what this means is agency priorities often reflect broader presidential priorities. So even if overall funding stays the same, you might see shifts in what research areas are emphasized, what kinds of funding opportunities are released, or what initiatives are prioritized. And then there are also tools like executive orders or presidential directives, which can guide agencies to focus on specific issues or programs. So again, the big takeaway is that Congress decides how much money exists, and then the executive branch helps determine how that money actually gets used. And this is why changes in administration can sometimes lead to pretty noticeable shifts in research priorities, even without major changes in funding. And so this is why over the past year, we've seen some shifts and uncertainty, both from the budget side and from the agency priorities. All right, Hilary, I'm tapping you in.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, so I want to zoom back out now to NIH and NSF, which are the primary funders of science in the United States. Most of you are familiar with this, but obviously there's a lot on the table. So one of the biggest issues that it's been an issue since I've been in science is really this flat funding appropriation for NIH and NSF. And, you might see like an incremental increase if you look at like NIH funding rates over past decades, but if you adjust for inflation, I should have had a figure here, but it's a cut. And there's more people entering science. Inflation costs are about a little over 3% every year, so even an incremental increase is a cut in reality. So the NIH budget, NSF budgets are always going to be advocacy issues for us. Clara already highlighted really nicely the timeline of how this works on a practical basis. But the reality is, most of the time you guys have heard about government shutdowns, failure to pass the fiscal year 2026 budget, for example. A lot of times what happens is called a continuing resolution, which basically means that Congress has just said, okay, whatever NIH funding levels were for last year, we're going to continue on that forward. And what that means is that there's no increase, that people that are waiting for grants might not get funded because NIH is being conservative. They don't want to overspend. So this has huge ripple effects. So some of the delays from last year, we're just now starting to experience. And there's a lot of different aspects to this. Is this on autopilot? This is kind of fun. I'm like, what's going to show?
Sorry, I can go back.
You're fine. There's a lot of aspects to it. Claire already mentioned what different NIH institutes want to fund. So advocating for the type of research we want to see fund, not just the funding level, protecting how grants are actually reviewed. They're being consolidated now. And then there's a lot right now about like indirect costs you guys have heard of. So there's a lot of ways that science is being attacked currently. If you want to open that figure. So I think everyone has heard about this right now, that there's been a stall in the number of grants awarded. So even if, I know people on this call who have really promising grant scores on NIH grants that are sitting after peer review, they're not being given to those investigators, and that just stalls the whole process. People can't hire, they can't do the research to progress their career. So that's another issue as well. Let's go on to the next one because I want to get to the activity for today pretty quickly. But it's been really a lot of doom and gloom, but I want you all to leave here today with one thing, and that's the tagline. This stuff actually works. So last year, for example, for fiscal year 2026, the president's office proposed a 40% cut in the NIH budget, which would have been devastating. And what happened was it wasn't a single person or group that stood up, but it was a unanimous across the scientific community. People were standing up for science, and there were rallies, there were letters to, lawmakers, there were meetings on Capitol Hill across all of these different organizations, and it worked. NIH actually got an increase, about a 3.5% increase, and NSF took a 3.5% decrease, but that was way better than what they were, in for. So let's go to the next slide. I think another take home is, beyond advocacy working, is that this is a continuous fight. Every single year we need to be advocating for science. I think you guys talked about previously, there's like science for or advocacy for science, or science for policy and policy for science. And the former is science for policy. That's like if you're using evidence to inform decisions about how access to mental health care is provided, or like climate mitigation. But what we're talking about with NIH funding is policy for science. So it's creating an infrastructure and an atmosphere where science and scientists can thrive. And I think that's just always part of being a scientist, is make sure that we're being good advocates of policy to support science. So that said, this year we're in another battle. There's a 12% proposed cut to NIH. And there's been some changes, the reconsolidation of institutes. You might have heard that total NSF committees were completely cut. So this is just another point of advocacy for you all. All right, let's go to the next slide. So, Claire, do you want to mention this? This kind of gets
Yeah,
into our activity for today.
sure. So one resource we really wanted to highlight again is the Society for Neuroscience's advocacy page and action center. So I think one thing that can feel pretty intimidating about advocacy is not knowing exactly what to say or what specific funding levels or policy priorities are actually supporting. So NSF does a really great job about making this easy and accessible. So they regularly post advocacy alerts that include very specific recommendations. So for example, this is an example of the dollar amounts that we're requesting for suggested NIH funding, things like the BRAIN Initiative or guidance just in general about broader research policies. So if you ever want to contact your reps but feel unsure about how detailed to get, these resources are incredibly helpful because they provide language, background context, and even, again, those concrete dollar amounts or policy asks that you can incorporate directly into your emails, phone calls, or meetings. So we'll drop the link in the chat eventually for the page to the advocacy thing. But rather than just talking about advocacy today, we wanted all of us to actually practice a really simple form of it together. So this activity should only take about 5 minutes, and the goal here is not to write the perfect email or become policy experts in one session, but the goal is really just to make advocacy feel more approachable and actionable. So I'd like each of you to draft a very short email. Honestly, it just has to be about like 5 to 6 sentences max that you could realistically send to one of your representatives. So this could be about research funding, mental health, science education, environmental health, or really any issue that's connected to your own work or interests. And then we'll come back together, and if anyone feels comfortable, we'll have a few volunteers share what they wrote. And then after that, we'll walk through how to identify your reps, so including your House reps and your US senators, because that's another thing that can sometimes feel confusing until the first time you do it. And then at the very end, we're going to encourage you all to actually send the email after the session and report back in the chat once you've done it so we can kind of see our collective impact as a group. So take the next 5 minutes to draft your email. I think Hilary's going to put some more direction in the chat.
Yeah, Claire, do you want to go to the next slide? Because we want to give you guys a kind of a menu. Do we have that in there here of options to advocate for? If not, I'll drop it in the
You want
chat.
this one?
Yeah. So here's kind of a draft for you all, just a boilerplate. Just start with who you are. It could be a concerned citizen, also a researcher studying, in my case, anxiety and PTSD. Why it matters. So research dollars matter for my own research, for my students, but also making cures for people who who the science will benefit the most. It's just off the cuff. Again, it doesn't need to be perfect. And then we want you all to focus on one of the below asks, or please feel free to create your own. A lot of these are really general or, again, based on large advocacy groups like Society for Neuroscience, but you could speak to just why funding science at the federal level is important for our country, for our future, for cures for whatever you're working on. Two is if you want to focus on NIH specifically, the budget ask for a couple of the advocacy groups are $51.3 billion, if you want to say that. And then the third one is if you want to focus more on what's happening with NSF, which is kind of a collection of budget and governance issues. And then, of course, feel free to make your own. So we'll put this in the chat as well, but take a couple of minutes. We're on the clock now, and feel free to unmute or reach out if you do have any questions. So, all right, we'll get started. feel like I'm a teacher or something. 3 minutes left to wrap up your statements. Okay, last minute, so start finalizing your statements, please. All right, time is up. Do we have any brave volunteers who want to start by reading their message? Don't be shy, we won't grade you.
I'm also happy to stop the recording so people might feel more comfortable. So go ahead and do it now.
Sure, thank you.